Doll. Bill Weaver traveled down from London on the slow afternoon train, with a change at Swindon on the way, and by the time he got to Bath, it was around 9 o'clock in the evening. The moon was coming up out of a clear starry sky over the houses opposite of the station entrance. But the air was deadly cold, and the wind was like a flat blade of ice on his cheeks. "Excuse me," he said. "Is there a fairly cheap hotel not far away from here?" "Try the Bell and Dragon," the porter answered, pointing down the road. "They might take you in. It's about a quarter of a mile along on the other side." Billy thanked him, picked up his suitcase, and set out to walk a quarter mile to the Bell and Dragon. He'd never been to Bath before. He didn't know anyone who lived there. But Mr. Greenslade at the head office in London had told him it was a splendid city. "Find your own lodgings," he'd said, "and then go along and report to the branch manager as soon as you got yourself settled." Billy was 17 years old. He was wearing a new navy blue overcoat, a new brown trilby hat, and a new brown suit, and he was feeling fine. He walked briskly down the street. He was trying to do everything briskly these days. Briskness, he had decided, was one common characteristic of all successful businessmen. The big shots up at head office were absolutely fantastically brisk all the time. They were amazing. There were no shops on this wide street that he was walking along, only a line of tall houses on each side, all of them looking identical. They had porches and pillars and 4 or 5 steps going up their front doors, and it was obvious that once upon a time they'd been very swanky residences. But now, even in the darkness, he could see the paint was peeling from the woodwork of their doors and windows, and that the handsome white facades were cracked and botchy. Suddenly, in a downstairs window that was brilliantly illuminated by a street lamp not 6 yards away, Billy caught sight of a printed notice popped up against the glass in one of the upper panes. It said, "Bed and breakfast." There was a vase of yellow chrysanthemums, tall and beautiful, standing just underneath the notice. He stopped walking. He moved closer. Green curtains, some sort of velvety material, were hanging down on either side of the window. The chrysanthemums looked wonderful beside them. He went right up and peered through the glass into the room, and the first thing he saw was a bright fire burning in the hearth. On the carpet in front of the fire, a pretty little dachshund was curled up asleep with its nose tucked into its belly. The room itself, so far as he could see in the half-darkness, was filled with pleasant furniture. There was a baby grand piano and a large sofa and several plump armchairs. And in one corner he spotted a large parrot in a cage. Animals were usually a good sign in a place like this, Billy told himself. And all in all, it looked to him as though it would be a pretty decent house to stay in. Certainly it would be more comfortable than the Bell and Dragon. On the other hand, a pub would be more congenial than a boarding house. There would be beer and darts in the evenings and lots of people to talk to. And it would probably be a good bit cheaper, too. He'd stayed a few nights in the pub once before, and he'd liked it. He never stayed in any boarding houses, and to be perfectly honest, he was a tiny bit frightened of them. The name itself conjured up images of watery cabbage, rapacious landladies, and a powerful smell of kippers in the living room. After dithering about like this in the cold for 2 or 3 minutes, Billy decided he would walk on and take a look at the Bell and Dragon before making up his mind. He turned to go, and now a strange thing happened to him. He was in the act of stepping back and turning away from the window, when all at once his eye was caught and held in the most peculiar manner by the small notice that was there. "Bed and breakfast," it said. "Bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast." Each word was like a large black eye staring at him through the glass, holding him, compelling him, and forcing him to stay where he was, and not to walk away from that house. And the next thing he knew, he was actually moving across from the window to the front door of the house, climbing the steps that led up to it, and reaching for the bell. He pressed the bell. Far away in the back room, he heard it ringing. And then at once, it must have been at once because he hadn't even had time to take his finger from the bell button, the door swung open and a woman was standing there. And normally you ring the bell and you have at least half a minute before the door opens. But this woman was like a jack-in-the-box. He pressed the bell and out she popped, and it made him jump. She was about 45 or 50 years old, and the moment she saw him, she gave him a warm and welcoming smile. "Please come in," she said pleasantly. She stepped aside, holding the door wide open, and Billy found himself automatically starting forward in the house. The compulsion, or more accurately, the desire to follow after her in that house was very strong. "I saw the notice in the window," he said, holding himself back. "Yes, I know. I was wondering about renting a room." "It's all ready for you, my dear," she said. She had a round pink face and very gentle blue eyes. "I was on my way to the Bell and Dragon," Billy told her, "but the notice in your window happened to catch my eye." "My dear boy," she said, "why don't you come in out of the cold?" "Well, how much do you charge to stay here?" "About 5 and 6 pence a night, including breakfast." Well, that was fantastically cheap. It was less than half of what he'd been willing to pay. "If that's not too much," she added, "then perhaps I can reduce it a bit. Do you desire an egg for breakfast?" Eggs are expensive at the moment. It would be 6 pence less without the egg. 5 and 6 pence is fine, he answered. I'd very much like to stay here. I knew you would. Do come in. She seemed very nice. She looked exactly like the mother of one of Beth's school friends welcoming one into the house to stay for the Christmas holidays. Billy took off his hat and he stepped over the threshold. Just hang in there, she said, and let me help you out with your coat. There were no other hats or coats in the hall. There were no umbrellas, no walking sticks, nothing. We have it all to ourselves, she said, smiling at him over her shoulders as she led the way upstairs. You see, it isn't very often I have the pleasure of taking a visitor into my little nest. The old girl is slightly dotty, Billy told himself, but at 5 and 6 pence a night, who gives a damn about that? I should have thought you'd be simply swamped with applicants, he said politely. Oh, I am, my dear, I am. But the trouble is that I'm inclined to be just a bit choosy in particular about my guests, if you see what I mean. Ah, yes, but I'm always ready. Everything is always ready, day and night in this house, just on off chance that an acceptable young gentleman will come along. And it's such a pleasure, my dear, such a very great pleasure when now and again I open the door and I see someone standing there who's just right. She was halfway up the stairs and she paused with one hand on the stair rail, turning her head and smiling down at him with pale lips. Like you, she added, and her blue eyes traveled slowly all the way down the length of Billy's body to his feet and then up again. First floor landing, she said to him, "This floor is mine." They climbed up a second flight of stairs. "And this one is all yours," she said. "Here's your room. I hope you like it." She took him into a small but charming front bedroom, switching on the light as she went in. "The morning sun comes right in the window, Mr. Perkins. It is Mr. Perkins, isn't it?" "No," he said, "it's Weaver." "Ah, Mr. Weaver. How nice. I put a water bottle between the sheets to air them out, Mr. Weaver. It's such a comfort to have a hot water bottle in a strange bed with clean sheets, isn't it? As you may light the gas fire any time you feel cold." "Thank you," Billy said. "Thank you so much." And he noticed the bedspread had been taken off the bed and that the bedclothes had been neatly turned back on one side, all ready for someone to get in. "I'm so glad you appeared," she said, looking earnestly at his face. "I was beginning to get worried." That's all right," Billy answered brightly. You can't worry about me." He put his suitcase on the chair and started to open it. "And what about dinner, my dear? Did you manage to get anything to eat before you came?" "I'm not a bit hungry, thank you," he said. "I think I'll just go to bed as soon as I can. Tomorrow I have to get up early and report to the office." "Oh, very well then. I'll leave you now so you can unpack. But before you go to bed, would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting room on the ground floor and sign the guest book? Everyone has to do that because it's the law of the land, and we don't want to go breaking any laws, do we?" She gave him a little wave of the hand and went quickly out of one room and closed the door. Now, the fact that this landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker, a little crazy, didn't worry Billy. After all, she wasn't only harmless, there was no question about that, but she was very kind and generous. He guessed that she had probably lost a son in the war or something like that and never gotten over it. So a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he went downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living room. His landlady wasn't there, the fire was glowing in the hearth, and a little Dotson was still sleeping in front of it. The room was wonderfully warm and cozy. "I'm lucky," he thought, rubbing his hands. "This is a bit all right." He found the guest book lying on the open piano, so he took his pen and wrote down his name and address. There were only two other entries above his page, and as one always does with guest books, he started to read them. One was of a Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff. The other was a Gregory W. Temple from Bristol. That's weird, he thought. Christopher Mulholland rings a bell. Now, where on earth have I heard that rather unusual name before? Was he a boy at school? No. Was he one of his sister's numerous young men, perhaps, or a friend, his father's? No, it wasn't any of those. He glanced down again at the book. Christopher Mulholland, 231 Cathedral Road, Cardiff, Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. Matter of fact, now that he thought of it, he wasn't sure at all the second name didn't almost have as much of a familiar ring as the first. Gregory Temple, he said aloud, searching his memory. Christopher Mulholland. "Oh, such charming boys," the voice behind him answered. And he turned and saw his landlady sailing into the room with a large tray in her hands. She was holding it in front of her, and rather high up, as though the tray were a pair of reins on a frisky horse. "They sound somehow familiar," he said. "They do? How interesting. I'm almost positive I heard those names before. Isn't that strange? Maybe it was in the newspaper. They weren't famous in any way, were they? I mean, famous, cricketers or football players or something like that." "Famous," she said, setting the tea tray down on the low table in front of the sofa. "Oh, no, I don't think they were famous, but they were very handsome, both of them. I can promise you that. They were tall and young and handsome, just exactly like you." Billy glanced down at the book. "Look here," he said, noticing the dates. "This last entry is over 2 years old." "Is it?" Yes, and Christopher Mulholland is nearly a year before that. That's more than 3 years ago. Oh, dear me, she said, shaking her head and heaving a dainty little sigh. I would never have thought of it. How time flies from us all, doesn't it, Mr. Wilkins? It's Weaver, Billy said. Weaver. Oh, of course it is, she cried, sitting down on the sofa. How silly of me. I do apologize. In one ear and out the other. That's me, Mr. Weaver. You know something, Billy said? Something that's really quite weird about all this? No, dear, I don't. Well, you see, both these names, Mulholland and Temple, I remember each of them separately, but somehow, in some strange way, they both appear to be connected, as though they were both famous for the same sort of thing, like Dempsey and Tunney, for example, or Churchill and Roosevelt. Oh, how amusing, she said. Well, but come now, here, dear, and sit beside me on the sofa, and I'll give you a nice cup of tea and a ginger biscuit before you go to bed. You really shouldn't bother, Billy said. I didn't mean you to do anything like that. He stood by the piano, watching her as she fussed about with the cups and saucers, and he noticed she had small, white, quickly moving hands and red fingernails. Almost positive it was in the newspapers that I saw them, Billy said. Think for a second, I'm sure I will. There's nothing more tantalizing than a thing which lingers just outside of your memory. He hated to give it up. Now, wait a minute, he said. Wait. Christopher Mulholland, wasn't that the name of that school kid who was walking tour on the West Country and then... Milk, she said, and sugar? Yes, please. And then all of a sudden, Eton schoolboy, she said. Oh, no, my dear, that can't be right. Mr. Mulholland was not an Eton schoolboy. He was a Cambridge undergraduate. Come here and sit next to me and warm yourself in front of this lovely fire. Your tea's all ready for you. She patted the empty place beside her on the sofa. She sat there smiling at Billy and waiting for him to come over. He crossed the room slowly and sat down on the edge of the sofa, and she placed his teacup on the table in front of him. Ah, there we are, she said. Isn't this nice and cozy? Billy started sipping his tea, and she did the same. For a minute or so, neither of them spoke, but Billy knew that she was looking at him. Her body was half turned towards him, and he could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him over the rim of her teacup. Now and again, he caught a whiff of a strange smell that seemed to come directly from her person. It wasn't unpleasant, and it reminded him of, he wasn't quite sure what it reminded him of, pickled walnuts, new leather, or maybe it smelled like a hospital. Mr. Holland was a great one for his tea, she said. Never in my life I'd seen anyone drink as much tea as him. I suppose he left fairly recently, Billy said. He was still puzzling his head about the two names. He was positive he'd seen him in the newspaper, in the headlines. Left, she said, arching her eyebrows. My dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple's also here. They're on the third floor, both of them together. And Billy set down his cup slowly on the table and stared at his landlady. She smiled back at him. Then she put one of her white hands and patted him comfortably on the knee. How old are you, my dear? She asked. 17. 17, she cried. Oh, that's perfect. Mr. Mulholland was also 17, but I think he was a little shorter than you. In fact, I'm sure he was, and his teeth weren't quite white. You have the most beautiful teeth, Mr. Weaver. Did you know that? They're not as good as they look, Billy said. Oh, they've got simply masses of fillings in them at the back. Mr. Temple, of course, is a little older, she said, ignoring his remark. He was actually 28, and yet I never would have guessed if he hadn't told me it wasn't a blemish on his whole body. A what? Billy said. Oh, well, his skin was just like a baby's. There was a pause. Billy picked up his teacup and took another sip of his tea. Then he set it down again gently in his saucer. He waited for her to say something, but she seemed to have lapsed into another one of her silences. He sat there staring straight ahead of him in the far corner of the room, biting his lower lip. That parrot, he said at last. You know something? It had me fooled when I first saw it through the window from the street. I thought it was alive. Ah, no longer, she said. It's most terribly clever the way it's been done, he said. It doesn't look dead. Who did it? I did, she said. You did? Of course, she said. You met my little Basil as well? She nodded towards the dog curled up so comfortably in front of the fire. Billy looked at the dog, and suddenly he realized this animal the whole time had just been as silent and motionless as the parrot. He put out a hand and touched it. The back was hard and cold, and when he pushed the hair to the one side of the fingers, he'd see the skin underneath grayish black and dry, preserved. Goodness me, he said. That's fascinating. He turned away from the dog and stared with deep admiration at the little woman beside him on the sofa. It must be awfully difficult to do something like that. Not in the least, she said. I stuff all my pets when they pass away. Would you have another cup of tea? No, thank you, Billy said. The tea tasted like bitter almonds, and he didn't care for it. You didn't sign the book, did you? Oh, yes. Ah, that's good. Later on, if I happen to forget what you were called, then I can always come down here and look it up. I still do that almost every day with Mr. Mulholland and Mr. Temple, Billy said. Gregory Temple. Excuse me, but haven't there been any other guests here except for those two in the last few years? Holding her teacup high in one hand and inclining her head to the left slightly, she looked at him out of the corner of her eyes and gave him another little smile. No, my dear, she said. Only you. What?